Now in this lecture, we are going to install Docker on Windows. So obviously you can skip it if you're on macOS or Linux. Now we can click on Get Started to be taken to the page where we can download Docker Desktop for Windows. And we will use that, but before we start doing that, actually go to Developers and then Docs here in the menu. And then there, click on Download and Install, and then Docker Desktop for Windows, so that you can learn about the system requirements which you have to meet in order to be able to install it. And you need either Windows 10 Enterprise, Pro, or Education, or Windows 10 Home to use Docker Desktop. If you have an older version of Windows, Windows 8 or 7, the next lecture is for you, because there I show you an alternative way of installing Docker. But if you have any chance of using Docker Desktop, which we're going to install in this lecture, definitely use that chance. So if you, for example, are able to upgrade to Windows 10, you might want to consider doing that. Now, if you got Windows 10 Pro, Enterprise, or Education, you need to have Hyper-V and containers features enabled. And in order to enable both of that, you can search for Windows 10 Enable Hyper-V to find certain instructions on how to do that. You best follow the approach described here on the official Microsoft web pages. And in the end, you just need to run one command to enable Hyper-V. You need to do that in PowerShell, which is a default tool that ships with your Windows installation, which you have to run as administrator. Now, once you are running this as administrator, make sure you copy and paste this command into PowerShell and simply execute it. And this will enable a functionality in your operating system which Docker Desktop needs to, in the end, run these Docker containers on your system. So make sure you enable this, and thereafter, in the same administrator started PowerShell session, run another command which you find in an attached file. Actually, in that attached file, you find both commands, but now we need this enable containers command here. And run this in your PowerShell as well. With that, you enable the two features which you need to enable. If you are on Windows 10 Home, then you got a separate page here with more steps you need to follow in order to install Docker Desktop. So click on that Install Docker Desktop on Windows Home link then, and make sure you meet all these requirements here. Specifically, you need to enable the WSL2 feature on Windows. And you got another link to the Microsoft documentation which informs you how you can do that. It's again, in the end, very simple. You first of all need to enable the WSL feature by running this command, again in PowerShell, started as an administrator. You don't need to do this on Windows 10 Pro, but you need to do this on Windows 10 Home. And then execute this command here in PowerShell. And once you did that, you need to update to WSL2 by following the steps outlined here. Thereafter, make sure you enable the virtual machine feature by running this command here in PowerShell as administrator. Obviously, you can also leave PowerShell up and running. So hit enter. And now with that, you need to download a Linux kernel update package, because WSL2 in the end is a Linux installation inside of your Windows installation. And that Linux installation will be used by Docker Desktop and by Docker itself then. Now therefore, we now needed to enable and update it. Now we need to download the Linux kernel update package, and that again can be done with the link you find here. It simply downloads a file which you can execute, walk through that installer, which should be super quick, and which in the end then just updates your Linux kernel inside of that Linux system, which you have inside of your Windows system. Then execute this command here in PowerShell as administrator to set version 2 of this Linux inside Windows solution here as a default version. and then install an actual Linux distribution of your choice. So that will then be the Linux operating system running inside of your Windows system, in addition to Windows, of course. It does not replace Windows, it just runs in addition. Now, here you can really follow these instructions and pick any distribution you want. Ubuntu is a very typical choice here. And simply then walk through the installer here and follow the other steps which are outlined in this article. You don't need to install the Windows terminal here. If you don't want to, you can, but you don't have to. And you're therefore done. Now, if you're facing any problems, also have a look at the troubleshooting guidelines here at the bottom of this Microsoft article, which you of course also find attached to this lecture. And once you did all of that, you're also prepared to install Docker Desktop on your Windows 10 Home installation. Again, this was not required, as I mentioned before, if you are on Windows 10 Pro or Enterprise or Education. Of course, you also must meet the hardware requirements outlined here and outlined here, which are the same requirements. And once all of that is set up, therefore, you now can use that installer, which you find on the Getting Started page. So simply download Docker Desktop for Windows, and then wait for this installer to be downloaded, which can take a while, of course. And once it is downloaded, walk through the installer. Now we're going to do this together, so let me just wait until this is finished, and I'll be back thereafter. Now, once this was downloaded, simply double-click on the downloaded executable to start the installer. You might be prompted to enable WSL2 Windows features, especially on Windows 10 Home, and you should then check this. If you don't have this option, you can also proceed without it though. If you're prompted to enable Hyper-V, then check this. So, long story short, whichever checkboxes you see here, just tick them. Of course, with the exception of the Add Shortcut to Desktop checkbox, that is up to you, whether you want to do that. Then click OK, and this will now install Docker Desktop and therefore the Docker tool on your system. Now, this again can take a while, so let's wait for this installation to finish. And eventually this should be done. Now, once this is done, you might be prompted to restart your system. If you are, of course, do so. And thereafter, after your system restarted, Docker might have started up automatically. Otherwise, simply execute Docker Desktop, this tool which we just installed. Make sure you execute and start it. And once you do start it, you should see this prompt here or this screen here. You also should have that whale in your system tray here, which proves that Docker is up and running. Here you can also always dive into the settings of Docker if you need to configure something, though for the most part you shouldn't need to do too much here. However, you should ensure that Docker is always up and running if you plan on working with it. So if there is no whale down there, you will not be able to execute Docker commands. So throughout this course, ensure that Docker is up and running if you want to work with it. Here in this graphical user interface, you can click on this gear icon to be taken to the settings, and here you can control whether Docker Desktop should start up when your system starts or not. For convenience, you might want to leave this turned on, but it's of course up to you. You also might have the option to choose whether WSL2 should be used. On Windows 10 Home, you should do that. On Windows 10 Pro, you can do it. As you see, it provides a better performance, but you can also use just this Hyper-V tool, which we enabled. Now, you don't need to do too much about the other settings you see here. You can ignore them for now. I will come back to them if we should need them throughout this course. And with that, we got Docker installed and we're ready to use it. You can now open up your regular command prompt. You don't need to run it as administrator. And there you should be able to enter Docker like this, and you should not get an error, but instead a list of commands you could use. And that proves that it works and that Docker was installed. Now we're soon going to use it for a more useful command than just this dummy command, but that's now the setup we need.